What's wrong with the world? Why is life not the way we want it to be? Why is there division? Why is there brokenness? In 1971, John Lennon, one of the Beatles, wrote a song with his solution to the problems of the world. It begins, "Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky." In the second verse, "Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too." Why is the world such a mess? John Lennon places at least some of the blame at the feet of religion, or more particularly, at the feet of God. Now, I'm aware that song was written 49 years ago. As famous and well known as the Beatles were, they are not the mouthpiece of current pop culture. Yet the ideas of that song have not gone out of fashion. Whenever I drive somewhere in the mornings, I like to listen to the phone-ins on BBC 5 Live. They're always relevant about things in the news at the moment. And I find it interesting to hear different points of view. As I've listened, I've noticed again and again this statement coming up, that part of the problem of the world is religion and God. Why do I mention that? Well, here, in this passage of Ecclesiastes, Solomon examines life without God. Remember his big question, where do we find ultimate life? Here he asks, is it found when we get rid of God? Is it found as we remove the concept of God from our lives and live without him? That's where Solomon's going in this passage. He airbrushes God out of the picture of life and asks, what are we left with? What's his answer? As we go through, we'll see that Solomon doesn't find the life of meaning in a world without God. Actually, he finds the opposite. If you get rid of God, you remove the foundation of any sense of a life of meaning and purpose. So let's have a look at that together. What does Solomon find when you remove God from the picture? First, he finds that to get rid of God means we don't matter anymore. That's his conclusion in verse 18. "I said in my heart with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves," and they themselves there could be read or should be read as by themselves, as in without God. We remove God from the picture. They are but beasts. If you take God out of the picture, what does Solomon say? We're just beasts. We're just animals. We're no different to the chimpanzee, the lion, the elephant, the dog, the mouse. This passage doesn't stop there. It carries on. Solomon explains himself. Why does he come to that conclusion? He tells us the end of the animal and the end of the human is the same. They both live and they both die. Here's how he puts it. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. I wonder how many of you like chickens. On Gardener's World last week, we were taken to someone's garden. It was full of two of the loves of his life, pots of tulips and his pet chickens. I have to say, it made me laugh. After working in chicken sheds on my holidays from university, I can't say I have any desire to have pet chickens. They're not particularly clever, and I don't find them particularly cute. If we discount the spiritual and we look at life from a purely biological and material perspective, what's the difference between a human being and a chicken? Is there any? Well, yes, in one sense. Different genetics makes us look different and gives us greater intelligence. But in another sense, no. We're the same. A bunch of cells with a constant progression of chemical reactions. That's what Solomon is getting at here. The Bible tells us that each human being is made in the image of God. Every person, regardless of gender, ability, nationality, background, is significant. We are separate from the animals. But if you discount the things that God says about us, what are you left with? We are no different from the animals around us. Our lives may vary in length, but we come and we go in just the same way. Over recent years, there's been increasing debate over assisted suicide here and around the world. If our lives get tough, if they're painful and our abilities disappear, the question is being asked, do we have the legal freedom to arrange our own deaths? If you go down to your local vets, you'll see this has been going on for years for animals. An animal contracts a serious illness. The fees are too big or the pain too great. What happens? At the owner's consent, the animal is put down. So why should we not deal with human beings in the same way? For the Christian, there is a clear answer, because everyone is made in the image of God and there is dignity and value in human life. But if you get rid of God and we're just another animal, the argument runs thin. In 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, released a book in which he claimed that God was dead. That's interesting because he was an atheist, so he never believed God was alive. He wasn't speaking, though, about a real death. He was speaking about the death of an idea. To him, humanity had now got to the point where they didn't need God or any concept of him. Now, he didn't make that statement lightly. He understood that removing God from the picture meant more than just eradicating the concept of a bigger being. He wrote, "When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole." That's what Solomon discovers here. If you deny God's existence, you do not just cut yourself off from knowing him, from the forgiveness he offers through Christ, and the hope for eternity. You remove the very foundation of so much that we hold dear in our culture. Respect for human life is left hanging in midair. That's what Solomon tells us here. But Solomon says more. He takes a look beyond the grave. This is what he says. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? Now, the Bible is full of statements that life does not end with human death. It tells us there is an eternity awaiting each and every one of us. It warns us to prepare for that day. It informs us that on that day, those who trust in Christ will go to eternal glory. But those who don't will go to eternal judgment. Eternity, life beyond the grave, is spoken of again and again. But the idea of life beyond the grave is not only something that Christians hold on to. Other religions speak of it. Even those of no religion have a hope of something more. A child's pet, or more seriously, a child's friend, grandparent, or even parent dies. What are they told? So many times I've heard people telling them, people with no faith or belief in God, they're up in the sky, smiling down on you. If you were to sit on a bench in a cemetery, you would see a trickle of people come into the graves of loved ones. Often they'll come with flowers to put in front of the gravestones. Many will stop and pause and speak, sometimes out loud and sometimes quietly, to the person who's gone. We don't want death to be the end. We desperately cling to the hope that there is life after death, life beyond the grave. But what does Solomon tell us here? If you remove God, if you take him out of the picture, there is no certainty for that hope. There is no foundation for life after death. It's just a story. It's just a comforting thought, but not a definite. Yet when we open our Bibles, we don't see this uncertainty. We see Jesus, God's Son who died on the cross for sin. We see Jesus, God's Son who rose from the dead. We see Jesus, God's Son, with his disciples after his resurrection, talking with them, eating with them. We see Jesus ascending into heaven with the promise he is coming again one day. And then, on the basis of those realities, a clear and undeniable statement that if you believe in Jesus, you will be raised from the dead and live with God forever. There is certainty built on the foundation of God, of his actions and his promises. What are we as human beings? I can't remember who said it, but someone once told me that we're just food for plants. We go through life, die, and then fertilize the ground. Is that it? If you discard God and the statements of the Bible and then follow that path to the end, that is where you end up. You don't end up at a life of meaning and significance. No. Getting rid of God doesn't open up that doorway. But there's more here. We're told that getting rid of God means we don't matter. We're also told that if we get rid of God, we remove hope for the oppressed. In chapter 4, Solomon continues to observe the world around him without a perspective of God. And the next thing that gets his attention is the oppression that he sees. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of the oppressed. As we look around our world today, we don't have to look far to see people being oppressed. It could be workers who aren't being adequately paid. It could be someone vulnerable who's being taken advantage of. Wherever we find somebody with power over another, who then uses that to their own ends, we will see people mistreated. We see them hurt. And we see their pain. That's what Solomon sees here. As he looks at the world around him, he sees people being abused, being trodden on, being hurt, and their tears fill his heart. What really gets him, though, is the hopelessness of their position. Twice he cries out. They had no one to comfort them. Life for the oppressed is often lonely. I've been reminded of this recently, reading an incredibly painful book, Hidden Evil by Errol Davis. It's a book written to help pastors, church leaders, and also church members to give a biblical and pastoral response to domestic abuse within the church. The book tells the stories of several women who were abused by their professing Christian husbands. And a husband, a pastor, who was abused by his professing Christian wife. As I read those stories, tears welled up in my eyes. Partly for the pain of their situation, but also for the aloneness that they felt. For years they lived in their prison of abuse and no one knew. When they opened up, barely anyone believed them. They had no one to comfort them. Yet the Bible's saying more than this. The lack of comfort here is not just the lack of a sympathizer, but the lack of a promise that it will get better. We're told here the devastating reality of abuse. On the side of their oppressors, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. An abusive relationship is always an unbalanced relationship. The abuser holds the power. The abused is trapped by it. You see that in the situation of child abuse. You see that in the abuse of evil regimes against others, whether their own citizens or those of other nationalities. What's the result? Those who are oppressed struggle to see any way out. At the age of 13, Jade began to feel depressed. She'd been bullied in school, and that became a constant stream of phone calls and texts telling her, "Kill yourself. Nobody likes you. Do us all a favour." By the age of 14, she started to think about suicide. Why? Here's her words. "I wanted to die. I could see no way out." Where's hope for Jade? Where is comfort for the abused wife or husband? Where's peace for the person thrown into jail who has done nothing wrong? One way that we could answer that is to point to all the charities and services that have been set up to help those oppressed. Around the world, thousands, if not millions, are involved in identifying oppression, supporting people who are oppressed, and helping them get out of it. I don't want to minimize what they are doing. This is good work that we should all be involved in some way. But let's be honest, it's only just scratching the surface. In our country, in our day, with all the resources at our disposal, there are still serious problems with slavery and the sex trade. We have issues with children being recruited into gangs. We always have to be careful with statistics, but the BBC reported that since lockdown, the numbers of calls to domestic abuse helplines have increased by 49%, and killings have doubled. Even with our best efforts, we are not getting a handle on this. The comfort we can bring is minimal. That's the frustration that Solomon knows here. That's why he cries out, "And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun." If we alone are the answer to the pain and injustice of oppression, Solomon says, then the dead are better off than the living. And the best off are those who haven't been born. Yes, those are negative words, and they sound very pessimistic about life, but I think we get his point. Yet the Bible tells us it's different when we have God in the picture. We've seen one of the struggles of oppression is that sense of being on your own. David, a man in the Old Testament, knew that well. For years, he was hounded by the king of Israel, King Saul. Saul wanted to kill David more than anything. And David had done nothing to deserve it. Actually, he'd done quite the opposite. At times, he was surrounded by others. But there were plenty of times when he was all on his own. In his situation, he called out to God, and this is what he found. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. As he cried out to God, what did he find? He wasn't alone. God was with him and watching over him. He could run to God and find a place of safety. If we consider Jesus, this statement just grows in meaning. Who is the God who is the stronghold for the oppressed? He is the one who came into this world in the person of Christ, the one who was mistreated, abused, mocked, and ridiculed and nailed to the cross. He is the one who experienced suffering and aloneness. He is the one who is with you when you call out to him. But that's not the only comfort the Bible gives us. It also tells us that God will one day deal with oppression and deal with those who oppress others. In the book of Psalms, God is referred to as the one who executes justice for the oppressed. Here in Ecclesiastes, Solomon reminds us that God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. No injustice is unseen by God. No injustice is ignored by God. All injustice will be dealt with by God. As plentiful and painful as oppression is, the Bible does give comfort. It tells us that if you cry out to God, he is there. It tells us that as hard and wrong as your current situation is, God will deal with it. Sometimes he does so in time, but always he does so in eternity. If you get rid of God, you lose that hope. When you remove God from the picture, there is no ending. There is no final accountability. Ultimate life cannot be found there. So what's the question here? Where do we find ultimate life? Where can we find life that counts? A life with meaning and significance? Is that found if we get rid of God? So far, the answers have been a clear no. Get rid of God and we don't matter anymore. Get rid of God and the oppressed have no hope. There's also a third thing we're told here. Get rid of God and we lose a higher purpose. In verse 4, Solomon considers life and the motive for work and training. Why do we work hard? Why do we put energy into bettering ourselves? If God's not in the picture, what are we left with? Here's what he tells us. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbour. Now, I have to admit that I've struggled a bit with this verse over the week. It is a stark verse and one that we can easily find offensive. What are we being told? If we remove God from the picture, we will not leave that gap empty for long. We will always fill the vacuum. In some way or other, we will fill it with ourselves. If we remove God, then we will live and work out of purely selfish motives. But is that true? Think of all the charitable work done in our day. On March the 13th, we had sports relief. Over £40 million was given. Surely that's not selfish. Or take Captain, now Colonel Tom, and his efforts to raise money for the NHS. How does that fit with this verse? In my later teens, I enjoyed watching Friends. Not the reruns, the originals. I remember an episode, I think I mentioned it a few months back, where Phoebe challenges Joey to do something completely unselfish. He does all kinds of things. He even signs up to be on the end of a telephone for a sports relief type event. Yet in everything he did, there was an element of selfishness, of self-promotion, or feeling good about himself. Let's be honest. That's true, isn't it? We're all prone to a bit of selfishness, and it lingers in so much of what we do. Yet this verse goes beyond that, doesn't it? It cites selfishness as the overriding motive in all that we do. Is that really the case? How are we to explain this? I think there's two parts to the answer. First, we need to remember what Solomon is doing here. He's removing God from life and then seeing what we're left with. He's following that ideology through to its conclusion. Then second, we need to be careful to recognize that our situation is not exactly the same as the one Solomon is envisioning. Although we live in a secular nation where the overriding thinking is not biblical, our nation is not a country where no one believes in God and no one acknowledges him. There is a mixture of belief and varying degrees of commitment to those beliefs. That and the rich heritage from a time where the Bible was more accepted still influences our nation. But that's not the only reason it's different. The Bible teaches us that God graciously restrains us in our sin. Let me give you an example. Earlier we mentioned that if we remove God, then we no longer matter. Without an understanding of God and his words in the Bible, then we are just animals. That's the logical conclusion of the secular materialism in our nation in our day. Yet that's not the way people are behaving about COVID-19. We're behaving as if all life matters. Everyone is significant. Now, I'm glad we're doing that. But I do realize it's inconsistent with the evolutionary survival of the fittest ideology of our day. Why are we doing this? God is restraining us. He is holding us back. Our thinking may have gone there, but thankfully our actions haven't. So what's this verse telling us? It's not telling us that there are no selfless acts in the world, that there is no one who thinks of others. It's saying that if we remove God and follow that through to its logical conclusion, what reason have we got left to live, to work, and to further ourselves? Ultimately, we're only left with one: ourselves. That's true for the hard worker. Why do they work so hard? To be better than others, to have more than others, to get to the top of the pile. It's also true for the lazy person. We're told in verse 5, the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Here, folding your hands is about doing nothing. It stands for a lazy life. Eating his own flesh stands for the self-destruction of this life. Why would someone do that? Why don't they work? Because they don't feel like it. They are serving themselves. Let's be honest. Is that all life's about? Is it just about us and fulfilling our desires? No. The Bible calls us to a higher calling. It tells us that there is a God and we're to live for his glory. Paul, in the book of 1 Corinthians, tells us, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. The Bible tells us there is a God who's incredible, he's awesome and amazing. A God who has infinite power, who's immensely loving, who's kind and generous, who's just and true. A God who's perfect in every way. And we're to live for his glory. And if we think about it, that gives meaning to even the simplest and smallest of tasks. In our homes, there are so many chores we have to do over and over. The washing, cleaning, fixing broken bits. It can become monotonous, can't it? In the workplace and at school, it can be the same. Even these tasks take on a new dimension as we do them with thankfulness to God and hearts that are seeking to praise him. Look, here is meaning. Even in the mundane, even in those tasks that are so often dismissed as beneath people. Do it for the glory of God, and it takes on an eternal significance. So kill God. Is that the answer to the life that counts? Is that the route to a life of significance and meaning? No. What are we told here? If we get rid of God, all we are left with is emptiness, just a striving after the wind. Can I ask you, where are you today? Do you find yourself tempted to walk away from God and to deny the statements of his word? Do you find that you're already there? I want to urge you to think about that position. I want to urge you to take it through to its logical conclusion. What hope does it offer? What answers does it give? What life does it nourish? How does it compare to the life the Bible speaks about? We all have a burning desire in our hearts for a life with meaning, a life that matters. This passage tells us it's not found by getting rid of God. It's found by accepting he's real, by turning to him, which we can do by receiving the gift of forgiveness in Jesus and living for his glory. I want to pray now that each of us will see this today. Let's pray. Father, help us to get what your word is telling us here. Help us to know that life with you is the best life to live. Help us not to be taken in by the arguments of the world today. Help us to know that secularism, painting you out of the picture, is not the road to true happiness. Lord, bring us to you. Thank you that there is mercy and forgiveness through Christ where we get it wrong. May we know you better. May we build our lives on your word and live for your glory. For Christ's sake. Amen.